My name is Natalie Cooper, and I've always believed that the quietest threads can weave the strongest stories. It's a lesson I learned from my mother, sitting beside her at an old, clanking sewing machine in our small apartment, the scent of rain-damp cedar drifting through the open window. For as long as I can remember, it's been just the two of us, a tiny universe of two in the sprawling, misty city of Port Blossom, Oregon. My father was a phantom, a story she never told with bitterness, only with a quiet sigh. Some people aren't built for the long haul, my love, she'd say, her hands never ceasing their gentle work. But you and I, we're woven from stronger stuff. We lived in a second-floor walk-up in the city's older, leafier district, a place where the rent was still reasonable and the neighbors knew each other by name. Mom, Alara, worked as a librarian at the downtown branch, a job that suited her perfectly. She moved through the world with a soft-spoken grace, her hands always tending to something fragile, be it the brittle pages of an old book or the delicate petals of the African violets on our windowsill. Her own fragility was a secret we kept between us. Alara was born with a heart that beat to a different, more delicate rhythm. A congenital condition that made her tire easily, that left her breathless after a flight of stairs, that had doctors warning her against the strain of pregnancy. But she wanted me more than she feared the risk. "You are my masterpiece, Natalie," she'd whisper, tracing the lines on my palm. The one creation that mattered most. Because of her health, I learned self-sufficiency as a second language. While other kids were running wild in the neighborhood parks, I was mastering the art of a perfect grilled cheese, learning to sort laundry by color, and discovering the quiet satisfaction of a well-dusted shelf. It was never a chore. It was an act of love, a silent promise to protect the woman who had risked everything to give me life. Her greatest gift to me, however, was her passion. She was the one who first put a needle and thread in my hand when I was 8 years old. Her old sewing machine, a sturdy beast named Bertha, became my closest companion. I started with crooked seams on fabric scraps, but with her patient guidance, I soon graduated to doll clothes, then to my own skirts, and finally, to the intricate, flowing dresses that danced in my imagination. She saw the artist in me before I saw it in myself. "Your hands are gentle, Nat," she'd say, her eyes shining with pride. "You'll stitch beauty into this world, I know it." I never dreamed of Paris runways or high-fashion magazines. My dream was smaller, more intimate, to create custom wedding gowns, dresses that would hold the hopes and stories of real women on the most important day of their lives. I couldn't afford a prestigious design school, so I enrolled in a vocational program at the local community college. Some people raised an eyebrow when I told them my chosen career, as if being a seamstress was a step back in time, a quaint but unambitious pursuit. But Alara's unwavering belief was all the validation I needed. Our life was rich in love, if not in money. We made do. We'd spend weekends repainting our kitchen cabinets a cheerful robin's egg blue, hunt for treasures in thrift stores, and celebrate birthdays with homemade pasta and a single, perfect cupcake. But there were quiet nights when I'd hear her muffled coughs from her bedroom, and I knew she was worried. Worried about the medical bills that were a constant, low-level hum in our lives, worried about what would happen to me if her heart finally gave out. And in those moments, I would renew my silent vow. I would work hard enough, save enough, and build a life secure enough to quiet her fears for good. That vow was the engine that drove me. It's why I worked long hours at a downtown alteration shop, why I took on side projects late into the night, why my social life was nearly non-existent. Meeting Leo Vance felt like the universe finally acknowledging my efforts. He saw me, or so I believed. He saw past the calloused fingertips and the simple, handmade clothes, and for the first time, I felt like my small, quiet dream might be part of a much larger, more beautiful story. That's why his silence at that dinner table was so deafening. It didn't just break my heart, it shattered the illusion that my hard work had finally earned me a place at a table where I belonged. Mom didn't know that yet. She was still at home, nestled among her books and her violets, completely unaware that the world her daughter had been so carefully stitching together had just been ripped apart at the seams. I didn't even notice the cold rain soaking through my blouse until it clung to my skin like a second layer. The streetlights of Port Blossom blurred in the downpour, casting long, wavering reflections on the wet pavement as I walked faster, trying to outrun the memory of that dinner table. My hair was plastered to my face, my carefully chosen shoes squeaking with every step, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Only hours ago, I believed I was about to start a new chapter of my life. Leo Vance, the man I had been dating for nearly a year, had invited me to dinner with his parents. He said it with that easy smile of his, the one that always melted my doubts. "It's time you meet them, Nat. You're important to me." Those words had echoed in my head as I stood in front of the mirror earlier that evening, carefully choosing my outfit and telling myself that maybe this was it. Maybe he was planning to propose soon. But nothing prepared me for what I walked into. The Vances were wealthy. Wealthy in a way I had only seen in magazines. Their house, a modern glass and steel structure overlooking the city from the West Hills, wasn't just big, it looked like something out of an architectural digest. The dinner table was a slab of polished oak long enough to seat 20, even though only 4 of us sat there, perched at one end like birds on a very long wire. From the moment I said hello, I felt like I had stepped into a world I didn't belong to. His mother's eyes, a cool, calculating blue, swept over me like a scanner. His father's handshake was firm, polite, but there was no warmth behind it. I tried to smile, tried to breathe, tried to ignore the tightening knot in my stomach as they began asking questions. Not the kind meant to get to know me, but the kind meant to measure me. Where did I go to school? Why just a vocational college and not a university? Wasn't tailoring a bit limiting as a career? Did my family own property, or did we rent? Each answer seemed to lower their already shallow impression of me. And Leo, he just sat there, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, never speaking up. Not once did he say, "She's amazing and I love her." Or even, "Mom, Dad, that's enough." He kept his eyes on his plate as if embarrassed by my very presence. I left before dessert. I couldn't sit there another second, pretending I wasn't breaking inside. I had hoped, stupidly maybe, that Leo would follow me, that he would take my hand and say he didn't care what they thought. But he didn't. I walked out alone into the storm, and he stayed behind. Now here I was, trudging through the rain, clutching my purse to my chest, as if it could hold my dignity together. I thought about heading straight home, but I couldn't, not yet. My mom's heart was too fragile for this kind of storm. Stress was her enemy, and she was always exquisitely sensitive to my moods. I couldn't just walk in crying, couldn't let her see the humiliation written all over my face. She'd been through enough already. She didn't need to carry my heartbreak, too. So I kept walking until I saw the warm, welcoming lights of a small 24-hour coffee shop on the corner. I ducked inside, shaking water from my hair and wiping at my face, pretending it was only rain that streaked my cheeks. The smell of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon wrapped around me like a blanket, and for a moment, I let myself breathe. But then the truth of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about Leo or his parents. This was about me. About every time I told myself I wasn't good enough because I didn't have a fancy degree or a trust fund. About every late night I had spent at my sewing machine, building a dream so small and personal I thought it barely counted. And about how I had pinned so much hope on someone who, when it really mattered, stayed silent. I curled my hands around a steaming cup of coffee and stared out at the rain. It blurred everything: cars, lights, people rushing by, but it couldn't blur the truth I was finally beginning to see. This wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was just the brutal, messy beginning of something I hadn't yet imagined. I still remember the first time I met Leo Vance, as if it were a scene from a movie I'd watched 100 times. It was at a small art gallery opening my friend Maya had dragged me to. I almost didn't go. I was tired from a long week at the alteration shop, and my wardrobe consisted mostly of practical, handmade pieces that felt out of place among the city's artsy elite. But Maya was persistent, and I ended up wearing a simple, deep green velvet dress I'd made for myself the previous winter. The gallery was a stark white space filled with abstract sculptures and the low hum of pretentious conversation. I felt like a wildflower in a greenhouse of orchids, clinging to a plastic cup of cheap wine like a life raft. And then Leo walked over. He wasn't like the others. Not at first glance. He didn't have that air of studied boredom I saw on so many of the men there. Instead, he had this warm, confident smile, and his eyes, a shade of warm hazel, actually seemed to see me. His suit was obviously expensive, but he wore it with an ease that made him approachable. "I haven't seen you here before," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble over the chatter. I managed a small, nervous smile. "Is it that obvious?" He chuckled. "Only because you look like the most genuine person in the room. It's refreshing." We talked for what felt like hours that night, leaning against a wall near a bizarre sculpture that looked like a melted traffic cone. We talked about my work, his ambitions in his family's investment firm, our favorite hidden spots in Port Blossom. He didn't flinch when I said I was a seamstress. In fact, his eyes lit up. "You actually make things? With your hands? That's incredible." "I just move numbers around on a screen all day." From that night, things moved quickly. He called the next day. We went for coffee, then dinner, then long walks along the riverfront. Leo had a magnetic energy, a belief that the world was his for the taking. His family's wealth was an undeniable part of his life. The sleek German car, the beautiful downtown condo, the casual mentions of ski trips to Whistler, but he never seemed to flaunt it. He praised my home-cooked meals, claiming they were better than any five-star restaurant, and he would often stop by my tiny work studio, watching with what I thought was fascination as I pinned and stitched. For months, I allowed myself to be swept away, to believe I had found someone who saw my worth beyond a bank statement or a university degree. But looking back, the warning signs were there, like faint, almost invisible stitches in a faulty seam. He never invited me to a real family function, always making excuses. "They're a bit formal," he'd say. "You'll meet them when the time is right." I held on to that promise, imagining a future where I would prove to them, and to myself, that I was worthy of their son. He seemed to admire my independence. "You're the hardest working person I know, Nat," he'd say, bringing me coffee on a late night at the shop. Those moments felt so real, so solid. He spoke of our future in vague, glittering terms, a trip to Italy, a summer exploring the coast. I thought he was building a life with me. I realized now he was just fitting me into a space in his own. When he finally said, "It's time you meet my parents," I thought it was the culmination of everything we'd been building. I told Mom the night before the dinner, and her face lit up with a joy so pure it almost brought me to tears. "See, I told you," she said, her hand on my cheek. "Good things happen to good people, my Natalie." I didn't tell her how terrified I was, how the fear of not being enough was a cold knot in my stomach. I wanted to believe in Leo. I wanted to believe in us. That's why I said yes. Why I wore the soft peach blouse I'd sewn myself, a piece of my heart on my sleeve. Why I rehearsed polite conversation in my head on the way there. I had no idea that one night would unravel everything I thought was true. The journey to the Fiancé estate was a journey into another world. I took the city bus, the familiar rumble a strange counterpoint to the anxiety churning within me. That's when I saw her. The bus was nearly empty, but near the front, a frail, elderly woman in a neat but worn wool coat was arguing quietly with the driver. Her voice was thin and trembling. "I just need to get to the hospital," she pleaded softly. "My grandson, he's there. I must have dropped my wallet. I can pay you back tomorrow, I promise." The driver, looking weary, shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Policy is policy. No fare, no ride." Other passengers stared out the window, a bubble of deliberate ignorance around them. But I couldn't look away. The woman's shoulders were slumped in defeat, her face etched with a quiet, desperate panic that resonated deep within me. Without a second thought, I stood up, walked to the front, and tapped the driver's shoulder, holding out a $10 bill. "For her fare and mine," I said quietly. The woman turned, her eyes, the color of faded denim, wide with surprise. "Oh no, dear. I couldn't possibly." "It's fine, really," I insisted with a warm smile. "Please sit down." "You said the hospital? Which one?" She hesitated, then sank into a nearby seat, clutching her handbag to her chest. "Evergreen General," she whispered. "My grandson, Elias, he had an accident at his construction site. They say he'll be all right, but a grandmother needs to see for herself." Then you definitely shouldn't be standing here arguing, I said gently, returning to my seat across the aisle. She looked at me, a genuine, soul-deep gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. There's no need, I replied. I'm Eleanor Albright, she said after a moment of quiet contemplation. Natalie Cooper. She smiled, a faint but beautiful thing. Natalie, you have a good heart. The world doesn't see enough of that anymore. We rode in silence for the next few stops, the only sounds the swish of the wipers and the hum of the bus. She got off 3 stops before mine, turning to give me a small wave. I'll remember this, dear, she called out just before the doors hissed shut. I smiled back, thinking it was just a kind phrase, a fleeting connection on a rainy afternoon. I had no idea that simple act, that $10 bill, would be the most important investment I'd ever make. By the time I arrived at the Vance estate, the drizzle had turned into a relentless downpour. The house loomed at the end of a long, winding driveway, a fortress of glass and stone that seemed to hold the gray sky at bay. I took a deep, shaky breath, smoothed my damp blouse, and told myself to hold my head high. I could do this. I was more than the sum of my circumstances. A butler, a real, honest-to-goodness butler, opened the door and led me into a foyer so vast and sterile it could have held my entire apartment twice over. A monumental crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its light reflecting coldly on the polished marble floors. Leo came down a floating staircase, smiling that easy smile I had once found so charming. You made it, he said, giving me a quick, perfunctory kiss on the cheek. For a fleeting second, I relaxed. Maybe I had been overthinking this. He led me into the dining room where his parents were already seated. His father, a formidable man with silver hair and a gaze that could appraise a company's worth in a single glance, rose slightly to shake my hand. Miss Cooper, he said, his voice polite but utterly devoid of warmth. His mother, elegant in a silk tunic and a string of pearls that probably cost more than my vocational degree, offered a smile so tight it looked painful. Natalie, is it? We've heard things. The sentence hung in the air, unfinished and vaguely threatening. Dinner began with a stilted conversation about the weather and a recent charity auction they had chaired. I tried to chime in, but every time I spoke, I was met with a brief, polite pause, a glance exchanged between them that clearly communicated, she doesn't belong here. Then came the interrogation, thinly veiled as polite inquiry. So, Natalie, his mother began, her fork tapping lightly against her porcelain plate. You're a seamstress. Yes, I said, trying to inject some pride into my voice. I specialize in custom alterations, and I'm hoping to open my own bridal design studio one day. She murmured, a sound of mild, dismissive interest. And where did you study for that? I attended the vocational program at Port Blossom Community College, I replied, my cheeks growing warm. Her lips curved. Oh, not a 4-year university then. No, ma'am. I wanted a program that would allow me to start working and helping my mother sooner. Helping your mother? Mr. Vance interjected, his eyes narrowing slightly. Is she unwell? I hesitated, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. She has a heart condition. I live with her to help out. How admirable, Mrs. Vance said, her tone making the words sound like an affliction. The rest of the meal was a slow, painful chipping away at my composure. They asked about our rented apartment, the number of clients I served, if I had ever considered a more stable career path. It wasn't just the words, it was the cool, condescending delivery, the unspoken judgment that hung in the air like a foul odor. And through it all, Leo was a ghost at his own table. He laughed at his father's dry jokes, nodded at his mother's pronouncements, and steadfastly avoided my pleading gaze. He didn't defend me. He didn't support me. He didn't even seem to see me. By the time a trio of miniature desserts was placed before me, my appetite had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard knot of despair. I placed my napkin on the table and stood, my movements feeling stiff and robotic. Thank you so much for dinner, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm afraid I need to get going. I have an early start tomorrow. Mrs. Vance's expression didn't flicker. Of course. It was enlightening to meet you. I stood there for a beat, my purse clutched in my hands, a desperate, foolish hope flickering that Leo would stand up, that he would walk me to the door, that he would say something. But he remained seated, already turning to murmur something to his father, as if my presence had been a minor interruption that was now thankfully over. So, I walked out alone. The rain was a torrent now, but I welcomed it. Each cold drop was a small, sharp sting that distracted from the gaping wound in my chest. As I walked down that long, dark driveway, the sound of my heels slapping against the wet asphalt was the only sound in the world, a lonely rhythm marking the end of a dream I had been foolish enough to believe in. When I finally made it home that night, I stood in the hallway for a full minute, practicing a smile in the dim light before turning the key in the lock. Alara's health was a delicate ecosystem, and the last thing she needed was the fallout from my emotional hurricane. I took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped the rain and tears from my face with my sleeve, and stepped inside. "Nat, is that you?" she called from her bedroom. Her voice, usually a soft melody, had a faint, reedy quality that instantly put me on high alert. "Yeah, Mom, just got in," I answered, my voice straining to sound bright and breezy. "It's a monsoon out there. My shoes may never recover." I heard the rustle of her blankets. "That's my girl, always dramatic. Did you have a nice time?" I paused, the lie catching in my throat. "It was fine. Just tired, that's all." I made a beeline for my room before she could emerge and see the truth in my swollen eyes. Under the hot spray of the shower, I finally let go, the silent sobs shaking my entire body as the humiliation of the evening washed over me again and again. In the days that followed, I tried to bury myself in my work. The rhythmic whir of the sewing machine, the feel of fabric under my hands, the focus required for a perfect stitch, it was my only solace. But life, it seemed, was not finished with me yet. A few mornings later, I found Alara at the kitchen table, her face ashen, one hand pressed against her chest. "Mom, what's wrong?" I cried, rushing to her side. She tried to wave me away with a weak gesture. "Just a little dizzy spell, honey. It'll pass." But I saw the fear flicker in her eyes. We were at her cardiologist's office that afternoon. After a battery of tests, he sat us down in his quiet, book-lined office, his expression grave. "Alara, your condition has progressed more quickly than we anticipated," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The medication is no longer managing it effectively. We need to talk about surgery." My own heart felt like it stopped. "Surgery? How soon?" "Within the next month," he said. "Ideally, within weeks. Without it, the risk of a major cardiac event is unacceptably high." I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "Okay. What is the cost?" The doctor's gaze softened with pity, and that was all the answer I needed. "For a procedure this complex, without comprehensive insurance, you're looking at a figure in the range of $150,000. The number was so vast, so impossible, it felt like a physical blow. It was more money than I had ever seen, more than I could hope to earn in 5 years, maybe 10. "Are there assistance programs? Charities?" "There are," he said, already pulling a brochure from his desk. "But the lists are long and the funding is limited. I can give you a list of foundations to contact, but..." He didn't need to finish. "Be prepared for a long and difficult fight." And time was the one thing we didn't have. That night, long after Alara had gone to bed with a sedative to help her rest, I sat at our small kitchen table, the doctor's list spread out before me like a map to a land of false hope. Over the next few days, I made every call, sent every email, filled out every online form. I told our story over and over until my voice was raw and my spirit felt frayed. The responses were a chorus of polite regret. "Our funding for this quarter has already been allocated. We prioritize pediatric cases." One particularly blunt administrator told me, "I'm sorry, dear, but your situation isn't compelling enough for our donors. A chronic illness just doesn't have the same impact as a sudden tragedy." I wanted to scream. My mother is dying. How is that not compelling enough? Finally, hollowed out by desperation, I did the one thing I had sworn to myself I would never do. I called Leo. He answered on the second ring, his voice casual, almost bored. "Nat, hey. Didn't expect to hear from you. Leo, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't an emergency, I began, my voice already shaking. It's my mom. She needs open heart surgery, and we don't have the money. I was wondering if you could lend it to me. I'll pay back every single penny, I swear. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a short, incredulous laugh. Alone? Nat, are you serious? My mother literally called this. She said you were probably from the kind of background where a crisis would pop up eventually. The cruelty of his words stole my breath. Leo, this isn't some scheme, I choked out, tears of rage and shame burning my eyes. This is my mother's life. Yeah, well, I'm sorry she's sick, but I'm not an ATM, he said, his voice turning cold and hard. You should have thought about that before you chose your career. Don't call me again. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, the dial tone a flat, mocking drone in my ear. Don't call me again. In that moment, I felt a despair so profound it was like drowning in ice water. My world had shrunk to a single, terrifying reality. My mother's life had a price tag, and I couldn't afford it. 2 days after that soul-crushing phone call, I was sitting on a bench outside Evergreen General, my head in my hands. Alara was inside undergoing some preoperative tests, a cruel irony given that we had no way to pay for the actual operation. I had tried to work that morning, but my hands shook so badly I couldn't thread a needle. The weight of it all, the fear, the debt, the utter, crushing helplessness, was a physical presence, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. That's when I heard a soft, familiar voice. Dear? Natalie, is that you? I looked up, my vision blurred by unshed tears. Standing before me, her kind face etched with concern, was the elderly woman from the bus. Eleanor Albright. Mrs. Albright, I managed, my voice a hoarse whisper. She smiled gently and sat down beside me, taking one of my cold hands in her warm, dry ones. I told you I'd remember you. Are you all right, child? You look how I felt the day I lost my husband. The dam of my composure finally broke. It's my mom, I sobbed, the words tumbling out in a messy, desperate rush. She's in there. She needs heart surgery, and it costs so much money, and I've called everyone, and no one will help, and I don't know what to do. She listened patiently, her gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, she simply squeezed my hand. You're the girl who paid my bus fare when I was on my way to see my grandson. You didn't even hesitate. I shook my head. It was nothing. Just a few dollars. It was everything to me, she said firmly. It was a moment of grace when I felt utterly lost. She looked over her shoulder and waved. Elias. Over here. A tall man in his late 20s, who had been waiting patiently by the entrance, walked toward us. He had the same kind eyes as his grandmother, and he moved with a quiet, steady confidence. Grandma, are you ready to go? Who's this? Elias. This is the young woman I told you about. Natalie, she said, her voice filled with a warmth that felt like coming home. And she needs our help. I started to protest, to say that she didn't owe me a thing, but the words died in my throat. Elias sat down on my other side, his presence calm and reassuring. Tell me what's going on, he said. His tone was so direct, so free of judgment, that the entire story poured out of me. My mother's diagnosis, the impossible cost, the rejections from charities, and even, in a moment of raw honesty, the cruel refusal from Leo. I spoke until there was nothing left to say, just the hollow echo of my own despair. Elias didn't hesitate for a second. How much do you need for the surgery? I stared at him, bewildered. What? No, I'm not asking you for money. I couldn't. I know you're not asking, he said calmly. I'm offering. My grandmother told me what you did for her. You gave her kindness and dignity on one of the worst days of her life. Some debts can't be repaid with just a thank you. Tears streamed down my face, but this time they were tears of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. Elias, I can't. It's too much. He shook his head, a small, determined smile playing on his lips. You can and you will. Because this isn't charity, Natalie. Think of it as an investment. An investment in a good heart, both yours and your mother's. Eleanor placed her other hand on mine. You helped me get to my grandson. Now let us help you keep your mother. For a long moment, I sat between them, holding their hands, a bridge of kindness spanning the chasm of my despair. Elias pulled out his phone. I'll call the hospital's financial office right now and make the arrangements. And Natalie, he said, turning to me, his gaze serious and kind. What do you dream of when you're not worrying about all this? The question was so unexpected it startled me. I've always wanted to open my own bridal studio, I whispered. To design my own gowns instead of just fixing other people's. A genuine, brilliant grin spread across his face. Perfect. Once your mom is on her feet, we'll talk about that too. My firm specializes in seed funding for local entrepreneurs. I have a good feeling about you. I gaped at him, stunned into silence. Why? Why would you do all this for a stranger? His expression softened. Because kindness should be paid forward. And because you remind me of my grandmother, quiet strength, a gentle heart, and a spine of steel. People like that are rare. The world needs more of what you have to give. For the first time in weeks, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in my chest. It wasn't the desperate, grasping hope I'd felt before, but something real and solid, like the first rays of sun after a long, hard rain. As we walked back into the hospital together, the three of us, I glanced up at the gray Oregon sky and felt a profound shift inside me. Sometimes, your world has to fall apart completely so you can see who is there to help you rebuild it. The surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday. True to his word, Elias handled everything. A call from his business manager to the hospital's administration department was all it took. The financial hold on my mother's file vanished. The billing coordinator called me herself, her tones suddenly warm and deferential. Ms. Cooper, just to confirm, your mother's procedure is fully funded. You have nothing to worry about. I sat on the edge of my bed after the call, whispering thank you to an empty room until my voice was hoarse. On the morning of the surgery, Elara gripped my hand as they wheeled her toward the operating room. Her face was pale but serene. Natalie, she said softly, her voice steady. Don't be afraid. Life has a way of turning our deepest wounds into the most beautiful scars. It's where the light gets in. I managed a watery smile. I'm not scared, Mom. Not anymore. The 6 hours she was in surgery were the longest of my life. I paced the waiting room, the linoleum floor a map of my anxiety. But I wasn't alone. Elias and Eleanor stayed with me, a quiet, solid presence. They brought me coffee I didn't drink, magazines I didn't read, and told gentle stories that kept the worst of my fears at bay. It was surreal how these two strangers had become my anchors in the storm. Finally, the surgeon emerged, his scrubs a faded green, a tired but victorious smile on his face. It went perfectly, he announced. The repair is stable. She's in recovery. With proper care, she has an excellent prognosis. Relief crashed over me with the force of a tidal wave, leaving me weak-kneed and breathless. I mumbled my thanks, my gratitude too immense for words, and sank into a chair, finally letting myself weep with the sheer, unadulterated joy of it. The months that followed were a gentle rhythm of healing. Hospital visits gave way to quiet days at home. Medication schedules became routine. Slowly, wonderfully, my mother came back to me. The color returned to her cheeks, the light to her eyes, and her laugh, once a fragile thing, grew stronger and more frequent. She started tending to her violets again, her hands moving with a newfound steadiness. I feel like I've been given a second spring, she told me one afternoon, her face turned toward the sun streaming through our living room window. Elias remained a constant, gentle presence in our lives. He would stop by with groceries or sit with Elara while I ran errands, the two of them chatting like old friends. He never once mentioned the money, never made us feel indebted. Instead, he would ask about my dream. One sunny afternoon, he sat at our kitchen table, a folder spread out between us. I wasn't kidding about that investment, Natalie, he said, his tone all business, but his eyes soft. I've seen the sketches you keep in your notebooks. They're extraordinary. You have a gift. Let me help you share it. It took some convincing. My pride was a stubborn, well-defended fortress. But Elias was patient. "This isn't a handout," he argued gently. "It's a partnership. I believe in your talent. I believe in your vision. Let me be the foundation you build on." And so, with my mother's blessing and Elias's backing, I said yes. I said yes to my own dream. 9 months after my mother's surgery, Evergreen Bridal opened its doors on a charming, tree-lined street in one of Port Blossom's up-and-coming neighborhoods. It was a small space, filled with natural light, soft colors, and the scent of cedar and fresh flowers. The journey had been a whirlwind of business plans, fabric sourcing, late-night sewing sessions, and endless, exhilarating work. But it was mine. On opening day, Elara stood beside me, her eyes shining with tears, clutching a bouquet of pink peonies from Elias. Our small shop was filled with friends, new clients, and our tiny, found family, Eleanor and Elias, beaming from the corner. As I cut the silk ribbon across the door, I realized that family isn't just about the blood you share. It's about who shows up with a lighthouse when you're lost in the fog. My friendship with Elias deepened, a slow, quiet blooming built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared laughter. There was a hint of something more, a gentle current pulling us closer, but we let it be, content in the comfortable, easy space we had created. One afternoon, a shy young bride-to-be came into my shop, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She'd been to a dozen stores and felt invisible in every dress she'd tried. I spent weeks with her, sketching, draping, and stitching, creating a gown that was uniquely hers. The day she came for her final fitting, she stood before the mirror, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. Then she burst into happy tears. "I feel like myself again," she whispered. "Only more beautiful." Her words echoed in my heart long after she left, for they were the story of my own journey. I had felt broken, small, and unworthy. But through the unexpected kindness of strangers and the unwavering love of my mother, I had stitched myself back together, stronger and more beautiful than before. Standing in my sun-drenched studio, surrounded by bolts of silk and spools of thread, I thought of Leo for the first time in months. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a distant, quiet gratitude. His cruelty had not been my ending, it had been the catalyst. His failure to love me had pushed me onto a path where I finally learned to love myself. I looked across the room to where my mother was laughing with Eleanor, their faces radiant with life. I was not just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And it all began with a simple act of kindness on a rainy bus ride, a single thread of compassion that had woven into a masterpiece of hope. The rhythm of my life settled into a beautiful, steady cadence. Mornings were for coffee with Elara, watching the light change over the city from our kitchen window. Days were a blur of silk, lace, and happy tears at Evergreen Bridal. My designs were gaining recognition in the city, celebrated for their quiet elegance and deeply personal touch. Each dress I created felt like a part of my own story, a testament to the idea that beauty could be born from healing. My friendship with Elias grew in the same gentle, organic way. He never pushed, never crowded my space, but was simply there. A constant, reassuring presence. He'd bring me lunch on busy Saturdays, his easy smile a balm to my frazzled nerves. We'd take long walks with Elara on Sundays, her arm linked through his, the three of us a small, unlikely, but perfectly formed constellation. There was an unspoken tenderness between us, a warmth that lingered in his gaze, a pull I felt whenever he was near. But we were content to let it unfold in its own time, a story that needed no rushing. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the shop opened, I was draping a bolt of cream-colored charmeuse on a mannequin, lost in the flow of the fabric. The bell over the door chimed, and I looked up, a welcoming smile on my face. The smile froze. Standing in the doorway, looking entirely out of place in my sanctuary of light and silk, was Leo Vance. He was older, his face a little leaner, but he wore the same expensive suit, the same air of effortless entitlement. Beside him stood a willowy blonde woman, her hand possessively on his arm. For a heartbeat, the air left my lungs. The scent of lavender and cedar in my shop was suddenly replaced by the phantom smell of rain on wet pavement, the cold memory of his parents' dining room. I felt a familiar, cold dread begin to coil in my stomach. But then, something else rose to meet it, a quiet, unshakable calm. This was my space. My creation. He had no power here. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my apron, and walked towards them, my steps measured and even. "Welcome to Evergreen Bridal," I said, my voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "How can I help you?" Leo's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second, as if he was surprised by my composure. "Natalie. Wow. You look amazing. The place is beautiful." "Thank you," I said, my gaze polite but distant. I turned to his companion. "And you are?" "This is my fiancé, Chloe," Leo said, recovering his charm. Chloe gave me a brief, appraising look and a tight smile. "We heard you're the best new designer in Port Blossom," she said, her voice high and bright. "Leo was just telling me you two are old friends." The words hung in the air, a stunning, audacious lie. Old friends. I met Leo's gaze, and for the first time, I didn't see the man who broke my heart. I saw a man I barely knew, a stranger defined by his weaknesses. "Mr. Vance and I were briefly acquainted some time ago," I corrected gently, my eyes never leaving his. "Now, what kind of gown did you have in mind?" The consultation was one of the most surreal hours of my life. I sketched as Chloe spoke, my hands steady, my questions professional. All the while, I could feel Leo's eyes on me. He kept trying to interject, to reminisce, to bridge the chasm between us with hollow pleasantries. "Remember that gallery opening, Nat? I knew you were talented even then." I simply nodded, smiled politely, and turned my attention back to his fiancé. I was a fortress, and he had no way in. By the time they left, Chloe promising to call to book the full design process, my hands were trembling, but my spirit was intact. That night, I told Alara and Elias. We were in my apartment, the three of us sharing a simple meal of soup and bread. Alara listened, her hands wrapped around her teacup, her expression fierce with a mother's protective love. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said softly. "You don't owe him your art. You don't owe him anything." Elias, who had been listening in his usual quiet way, finally spoke. "She's right, Natalie. But this is your decision. Whatever you choose to do, I'm with you. Just remember, you're not that girl on the bus anymore. You're the one driving." His words, his unwavering belief in my strength, were the final stone in the foundation of my resolve. I knew what I had to do. I called Chloe the next day and asked to meet with them both one more time before we signed any contracts. We met at my shop after hours. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the floor. I sat across from them, my hands resting calmly on the table. "Chloe, your vision for your gown is beautiful," I began, my voice soft but firm. "However, I won't be able to be the one to create it for you." Chloe looked stunned. "Why not? Is it the timeline? The budget?" I shook my head, my gaze shifting to Leo. "My design process is a very personal one. It requires a level of connection and trust, and emotional honesty that I give to every single one of my clients. And in this particular situation," I said, meeting his eyes without flinching, "I don't believe I can offer you that. It wouldn't be fair to you or to the integrity of my work." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't bring up the past. I simply stated my truth, my boundary, as a fact. Leo stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. For the first time, his polished facade cracked, and I saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes, disbelief, regret, the dawning horror of a man realizing exactly what he had thrown away. He had expected me to be flattered, or vindictive, or maybe even secretly still in love with him. He was not prepared for this calm, centered woman who had no need for his validation. "I wish you both the world of happiness," I said, standing up. "And I have a list of several other talented designers in the city who I know would do a beautiful job for you." I walked them to the door, the final, quiet act of a chapter closing for good. After they left, I stood alone in the center of my shop, the moonlight pooling around my feet. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt peaceful, free. The last ghost had been gently, firmly shown the door. A few minutes later, I heard a soft knock. It was Elias. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his expression questioning. I saw them leave. Are you okay? I nodded, a genuine, unburdened smile spreading across my face. I'm more than okay. He walked towards me, his eyes searching mine. I knew you would be. He stopped just before me, the space between us charged with everything we hadn't said for a year. The scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of sandalwood and something clean like fresh rain, filled the air. Slowly, as if asking permission, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers warm against my skin. Natalie, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You are the strongest, kindest person I have ever known. And in the quiet, moonlit sanctuary I had built for myself, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a kiss of fiery passion, but one of slow, dawning recognition of coming home. It was a kiss that tasted of patience, of respect, and of a love that had been quietly growing in the light all along. As I wrapped my arms around his neck, I knew this was no longer the beginning of something I hadn't yet imagined. This was it. This was the story, woven from threads of heartbreak and kindness, of loss and love, a beautiful, resilient tapestry that was finally, completely my own.